obviously we'll need the jury, so let's bring them in. Very good. Ms. Coy, you
Your Honor.
may inquire.
Good afternoon, Dr. Goldberger. How are you?
Great. Hi.
Good. Now, you're not a medical doctor, correct?
I'm not.
And you're not a doctor of pharmacy, correct?
I'm not.
Okay. And you don't hold a clinical degree?
I hold a clinical license from the state of Florida, clinical
Right.
laboratory license.
Okay. And the license that you have doesn't authorize you to actually care for patients, correct?
In my position at the university, I assist in the care for patients from time to time, giving consults to the emergency department or physicians on the floor.
Right, but talking to actual patients, not the physicians, but actual patients themselves. Your license doesn't do that, correct?
No, I don't meet with patients face to face.
Okay. And in fact, your license is listed as a clinical laboratory director, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And the clinical laboratory essentially means it's the physical location in which one or more of the following services are performed, and that's laboratory services,
Yes.
all right? Examination of fluids or other materials taken from the human body,
Yes.
anatomic laboratory,
Doesn't apply to my work.
doesn't apply to yours, okay. And you ensure that the reports are test results include important information required for interpretation.
Yes, and I do that and have done that.
All right. So you make sure that those reports are suitable for the doctors who are going to be interpreting them later.
Yes, and that's my work with UF Shands.
All right. And a majority of your experience deals with decedents, dead people, correct?
In part, I used to be director of the clinical toxicology laboratory where we performed thousands of drug analyses for patients at UF and Shands, and that would be for living patients. That laboratory was closed a few months ago, so I'm no longer in that position. But I still serve as a subject matter expert for the health system when there are issues that physicians need help with.
Right. That the physicians need help with,
Yes.
correct? All right. But primarily now, you deal with mainly decedents and results of that nature.
Yes, at the current time.
Okay. And it's true that you're not able to make clinical interpretations, correct?
No, in my position as the clinical laboratory director or the director of the clinical toxicology laboratory, I was making clinical interpretations, and those interpretations were entered into the patient's file.
I'm talking about currently. You're not allowed to make clinical interpretations now, correct?
Well, I'm allowed, but I don't because that laboratory has been closed. There's no reason why I cannot do that. If a physician contacts me, I can put a notation in someone's electronic medical record.
And so you testified that MDMA, you kind of characterize it as a love drug?
It is.
Okay. It's a Schedule II drug, correct?
No, it's illicit, Schedule 1.
This is Schedule I. It's illegal,
It is.
okay? If found on a person, it's a felony.
It is.
I did say it's illegal, right?
Illegal, yes.
Okay.
Not legal.
Now, symptoms of taking MDMA can also be found in the form of anxiety. Would you agree with that?
No, it's not likely.
Okay, you don't believe that the symptoms of MDMA, that anxiety is one of the symptoms of MDMA?
Well, there's a paper in the literature that looked at anxiety and irritability and depression, but that was day 4 after use on a weekend. But during acute intoxication or intoxication while the drug is in the blood, anxiety is not a usual symptom.
Now, this paper that you're talking about, when you say day 4, you're talking about the study that looked at day 0, day 4, and day 7, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
That study, they essentially picked those specific days, day 4 and day 7.
They did.
Okay, there's nothing about day 1, day 2, day 3, correct?
No. Well, they had day 0, which is the day of, I suppose.
Right.
But that's the beginning.
Right, but again, that paper did not discuss day 1, day 2, day 3. I guess day 1 would be considered day 0, but it didn't talk about the days in between, correct?
No, they did not. Just those 3 days, 0, 4, and 7.
All right, so those days, those symptoms could have been exhibited on those days as well. The paper just chose not to address those days.
Maybe 2, 3, I mean, that's all speculation, what the feelings were post-acute use. In this case, we know that the MDMA was used, likely used on the day of the incident because of the blood drug level.
Right, and we'll get to that. But you're not telling this jury here that the only symptom of MDMA is just euphoria, correct?
No, there's other effects as well.
Okay, and anxiety can be one of them.
I don't believe so.
Okay, what about impulsivity?
I don't really believe so, no. No,
Aggression?
no.
Well, what are the symptoms besides euphoria and happiness that you see in MDMA?
There's the empathy for others. There's the well-being, which is euphoria. There's a sense of peacefulness. There's the increased in sensation. That's why there typically is a lot of touching, not necessarily sexual touching, but there's touching. Those are the types of feelings, effects that an individual who's using ecstasy feels when the drug is administered or ingested.
Okay, and you testified that the levels in Mr. McLaughlin's system, I think it was 459.5,
Yes.
and that is a level of impairment, correct?
Yes, I believe he was impaired to some degree. There's no way to really quantify that.
Well, it's quantified by the level of 459.5, correct?
The concentration is quantified, but not the effect.
Okay, but you do believe that he was impaired at the time?
To some degree, yes.
Okay, and you watched the video and you saw when Mr. McLaughlin came out and shoved Mr. Drejka?
Yes, it was almost like a schoolyard push.
Oh, okay, and it wasn't very lovey-dovey or touchy-feely as you just testified to this jury?
You're right, it was not.
Okay. And do you recall having your deposition taken?
Yes, a few months
Okay.
ago.
All right, and you also basically said that MDMA is generally a safe drug.
It is, because we rarely see it causing overdoses, and those would be non-fatal or fatal overdoses. We just don't see it.
Okay. But people have overdosed from taking ecstasy, correct?
Yes, people have overdosed and have died as a consequence of ingesting ecstasy.
Now, you talked about the fact that it is under a clinical evaluation now for the treatment of PTSD.
Yes.
Call that. And isn't it in fact true that it's actually where those clinicians want to be able to use it in an actual clinical setting with their patients, not to just take on your own over-the-counter or through prescriptions without being observed by a clinician, correct?
That's right.
All right, so we just got to make that distinction pretty clear. You're not talking about it, they're looking at it so that people can just take it to treat PTSD.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever see it as a take-home medication.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to be possible. But it is used in the clinical treatment, the counseling part, the talk counseling that goes on to treat PTSD.
And under the care of a actual clinician at the time while they are there,
That is correct.
not with the person on their own just taking it without that licensed person with them.
I hope so, yes.
And you said that that they were looking into that about 15 to 20 years ago?
That's right. I remember when MDMA was quite popular in the rave scene, when there were raves here in Florida. And there was some talk at that point and some TV shows that talked about the clinical use of MDMA. And now it's reached to the point where it's in phase 3.
Right. But it's still 15 to 20 years now, and it's still in a trial. It's still not approved, correct?
That's right. And I think one difficulty would be that it is a Schedule I substance, and to move a drug from Schedule I to legitimate use would take a lot of work.
So when we talk about the MDMA that was in Mr. McLaughlin's system, the report was there was the MDMA and there was a metabolite, correct?
That's right, the
And
MDA.
All right, and it could be a metabolite or it could not be a metabolite of the actual MDMA, correct?
Yeah. I think in this matter, it seems to me, because I've seen many cases of MDMA ingestion, that the MDMA is metabolized to the MDA, and we see the MDA in this case. It's possible, but I don't think it's likely, that the decedent also ingested MDA, because MDA can also be available.
Right. Well, I understand that you think it's not possible, but so we can be accurate, you don't know that, though.
That's right.
Okay, so those are two separate drugs, MDMA and MDA.
That's correct.
And it can be a metabolite, the MDA, or it could not be a metabolite.
Yeah, it is a metabolite, and it is also
It's
a
a
drug.
separate drug.
Yes,
Correct.
ma'am.
Thank you. Now, we talked about the concentration was 459.5. Isn't it true that a person can exhibit symptoms of that at 0.1?
Yes.
All right, and so we're talking about at 0.1, a person can exhibit symptoms of MDMA, and Mr. McLaughlin had 459.5.
Yes, but remember, I don't know exactly what his concentration was at that moment of the incident and his death. His death was soon after he was shot, because the levels aren't static, they change.
Right,
So
and you talked about that. You talked about the levels could go up or they could be down, or they could be the same.
that's right.
So in this case, we could be talking about it could have been higher
It could
than the
have.
459.5,
It could have been.
and it could have been lower,
Yes,
or it could have just been 459.5.
that's correct.
And so, just so I make sure, we're talking about those are in per milliliter, correct?
Per milliliter of blood, right.
Okay. And anything over 10 is considered positive.
The medical examiner's office referred a blood sample to a laboratory called pinpoint testing for the quantitation and I think also rescreening. And that laboratory was using 10 nanograms per mil as a cutoff or threshold, so anything 10 or greater would be positive.
Okay, thank you. Now, talk to the jury a little bit about half-lives. You know what the half-life of MDMA is, correct?
Yes,
All right. And essentially, it can be anywhere from between 4 to 10 hours, correct?
yeah, I was going to say 4 to 9, but that's right.
Okay. And so what we do know is, at a minimum, that MDMA was taken that day.
I think it was, yes.
Okay.
Most certainly.
All right. And you don't know if it was an hour before, 2 hours before, right? You don't know when that day, but it was definitely taken that day.
I would say more than likely at least an hour before because the decedent would have had to ingest the MDMA. It'd have to reach his bloodstream, which takes 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and then there's some metabolism that could occur. So I'd say at least an hour. I can't be perfect with my estimate, but close.
Okay. And that's a pretty, 4 to 9, 10 hours, that's a pretty long time, correct? For that to be in your system.
Well, actually, that's a half-life, which means to go from a starting concentration to half of that concentration. So the drug in the blood is going to persist longer than that 9 hours or whatever the endpoint is for the half-life. So if you ingested that day, it might be in the blood for the following day, but low levels at that point. The duration of effect, like when he feels that effect, is much shorter, maybe between 4 and 6 hours.
But we've established at the 459.9, that's a high level.
I don't like to, I think even when the state asked me that, I don't like to qualify it as low, medium, or high, partly because we don't know exactly what it was at the time of death. But I like to use the term typical or usual blood drug concentration for someone who's using it recreationally.
Okay.
It's a common concentration.
Okay. And you said that it could have also been higher based on this, I think you said I don't know what the term is, I'm not a...
Redistribution.
Redistribution, that's what it was, thank you. Now, much of your experience is in the area of operating motor vehicle or equipment while impaired by alcohol and/or drugs, correct?
Most often when I testify, it does relate to operation of a motor vehicle.
Okay. And you agreed that the concentration levels in Mr. McLaughlin's system were consistent with recreational use?
It is, yes.
Okay. And you would agree that there are other outside factors that also play into how a drug affects a person and their symptoms to it. Age, there's other, what are some of the outside factors that can also affect a person? Their
Yeah.
history,
Yeah.
what are the other ones?
Yeah, you have to look at it kind of contextually along with the individual's history and maybe prior experience with the drug. But there certainly are not necessarily age effects that I would characterize, but circumstantial or conditional or environmental effects can affect one's response to a drug. Because if one is influenced by the drug, then there could be an altered behavior. So you look at that.
Okay. And it's fair to say that one person may not react the same way as another person reacts with the same drug, correct?
Yes, for sure.
All right. So when you say that it's a love drug and it's lovey-dovey, it may not be that way for another person.
Well, you know, I really don't know of instances where the use of ecstasy is directly linked to, say, acts of aggression, because it's not that type of drug. If we were speaking about other stimulants, yes, for sure, you see diminished inhibitions and acts of aggression with those stimulants. But with MDMA, it is a stimulant, but it has that other the empathy effect, the love effect, that's different.
What about impulsivity?
Yeah, I think I was asked that before, or you asked me that, right? I don't think so.
And you're not aware of any studies out there that discuss the long-term effects of MDMA use, correct?
There's been some attempt to look at the long-term effect of MDMA usage. I haven't seen anything that seems to be really deleterious, because we used to speak about that 15, 20 years ago, that you just don't know what you're doing to your body and your brain when you're ingesting this illicit drug. But since that point, I haven't seen anything that would indicate that it's that harmful.
Now, in your profession, you only do work on about 25 cases per year on actually living individuals. Most of that's all spent on decedents, correct?
Most of my work, because I run the forensic lab at UF, is with decedents. But we work with law enforcement agencies. Many of these cases are driving cases, and those would be living individuals. And from time to time, we do see MDMA in drivers. Not often, but sometimes.
Okay. And Dr. Goldberg, have you ever been precluded from testifying about the opinion you're giving here today in court?
No.
And I think you talked about this on direct with the state, but a person doesn't have to be having hallucinations or a severe physical reaction to be having negative effects, correct?
That's correct, but it depends on what you define as negative, particularly when you talk about ecstasy, for example, and the touching that may occur, whether borders are passed when someone's touching one another at a rave.
And so when the state was questioning you, you were looking at it from the perspective of just seeing, which I think you used the word several times, whether Mr. McLaughlin looked normal, correct? Yes,
I said he looked completely normal when I viewed the video, and that's when he left his vehicle into the Circle A, is that what it was called?
Correct.
And while he walked around and shopped in there, and when he went outside, up until the point there was the pushing. And actually, even afterwards, I thought his response was normal after the push.
Okay. And so just to be clear, when you're talking about, obviously on the video, you're watching Mr. McLaughlin and he's alive and you're basically giving an opinion on him as he was still alive, correct? But that's not what you do in your normal practice.
Not necessarily. In many of the cases I work with law enforcement, more and more I see body cams, I see surveillance, surveillance from buildings, from light poles. So more and more I do rely on video evidence when it's available.
Right. But the bulk of it, again, is in getting those things for the actual doctors that need those reports, correct? That's the majority and the bulk of your expertise, or the bulk of what you do.
Well, I run the toxicology lab, and we work about 2,500 death cases per year. So in some of those cases, there are videos as well. I don't typically review those, but sometimes there are videos.
You don't typically review those, you said, though.
No, it could be a video of a hanging or a shooting. It's really not necessary for me to review those in the context of a toxicology test.
Okay. And so, just want to be clear, no one is saying that a person has to be having a bad reaction or a severe acute reaction to MDMA to have a negative psychiatric effect of the drug. That's not what you're saying.
That's not exactly what I said, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I think it's how you define that negative response, because my definition for negative might be a little bit different than yours. I think in the end, you just have to review it contextually to look at all the evidence, and that's what I prefer to do.
Okay. If I can have one moment, Your Honor. Just a few more questions, Dr. Goldberger.
Sure.
Now, you provided the state with a list of all your court testimonies that you've actually been involved in, correct?
I did.
Right, and you testified on direct that you testified equally for the state and well, you didn't say equally, you just said you testified for the state and you testified for the defense.
It's predominantly for the state because my name appears on many hundreds or thousands of reports every year. So I don't really have control over that. I'm a state employee, a state toxicologist, so the state utilizes me often.
Okay, so it is predominantly for the state.
For sure.
All right, and when you provided your listing of court testimony, you didn't specify in each particular case whether you were doing it for the state or the defense.
I don't know if you have the list in front of you, but for the first section, which would be court testimony or trial appearance, on the style of the case, the party that's underlined is the party that I testified for. Or
Okay.
I don't really testify for them, I'm engaged by them to testify.
Okay. And that's not unusual. If somebody wants you to give their opinion, they hire you to do so, and you'll give your opinion, correct?
Yes, and I'll do it for the defense as well.
Right. And how much are you getting paid in this case?
I just get my regular salary from the university. I don't get supplements to my salary because I'm here today.
I understand, but the state attorney's office paid the university, which obviously goes into your salary, correct?
In a very, very indirect way, I have a line, an employee line at the university, and I get paid my salary. Those funds that are collected for my time spent on this matter, a portion goes to the university. I have no idea where it actually ends up.
Right.
The other portion is used to support professional development of my staff. For example, travel to meetings.
Okay, so.
But no salary.
No salary,
No.
but you and/or the University of Florida is being compensated for your testimony here today. Is that a
Yes.
fair statement?
Yes, someone has to pay for my time here because
Right,
I'm out
I mean,
of the
because
office.
you gotta eat, right?
Well, I have a salary, so it doesn't matter if I'm here or not, but if I'm out of the office, the university requires that my time be compensated for.
Okay,
But I don't see anything from that.
all right. But University of Florida is getting paid for you to be here today?
Yes, actually, the clinical enterprise at the University of Florida, it's still the University of Florida, but it's our clinical enterprise.
Do you know how much they bill you out for?
For today, or for any day out of the office, it's $1,500.
All right. Further questions? No further questions. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Any redirect examination?
Yes, Your Honor, briefly.
Don't rush me.
So just to follow up a little bit, you used the name UF Shands. What's UF Shands stand for?
Well, UF is University of Florida. I think the technical name might be UF Health Shands. Those are just marketing terms, but UF is University of Florida and Shands is Shands Hospital.
Okay, so that's what I was trying to get at. Shands is a hospital.
Yes, sir.
All right, and you get a salary, you indicated?
I have a salary.
All right, and if you testified 4,000 times, you'd get the same salary.
That's correct.
If you never testified, you get the same salary.
That's correct.
And the laboratory that you work at, that's an independent agency, kind of like the medical examiner, correct? Meaning this, you're not associated with any state attorney's office.
Oh, yes, that's correct. We are an independent reference lab, so we are not associated with a state attorney's office. We're only associated in an indirect way with the medical examiners that we serve.
Okay, and you're not an employee of the medical examiner's office?
Well, I do serve as a director of the medical examiner's office in Gainesville in my position as division chief. But I don't think I answered your question right. No, I don't.
Okay. So again, you're just an independent agency that's not affiliated with state attorney's office, law enforcement. That's where I was going.
That's correct.
All right. Now, the defense counsel asked you about a study and asked you if that particular study dealt with day 1, day 2, day 3. You recall those questions?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about day 0. What does day 0 mean?
That's on the day of use.
Okay. So in this particular case, day 0 would be July 19th of 2018. Is that a correct statement? Or the date of the offense?
That's fine. I don't know the date exactly.
Okay. But assuming that the date the shooting took place was July 19th of 2018, that would be day 0.
Yes.
Okay. And your testimony is that Mr. McLaughlin ingested this drug. You can't say exactly when, but recent. Could be an hour, could be a little bit later than that, but fairly recent.
I think it was, yes.
And when we talk about touchy, okay, let's talk about what touchy means, like in the rave sense, okay? When you say touchy, and with the rave clubs, do you mean like boxing and karate and that type of touching?
No, it's gentle touching. It's typically non-sexual touching, because basically with MDMA, there's an increase in sensory perception. That's the type of touching, not pushing touching.
And defense counsel asked you if you did a lot of testifying in motor vehicle cases. You recall that question?
Yes.
Okay. And when you're testifying about motor vehicle cases, you're testifying about whether someone's normal faculties were impaired. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And you're testifying whether or not alcohol or controlled substances were affecting their normal faculties, correct?
Yes, that's what I do.
And when you testify, you're talking about whether or not they're under the influence of those particular substances, correct?
Yes, and my testimony is contextual as well.
Okay. And that's really exactly what we're talking about here, if someone's impaired or under the influence, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this is in line with all the other testimony that you've given as an expert, as a forensic toxicologist, correct?
More or less, yes.
The other thing that you talked about was looking at a case contextually. Okay. Is that basically, saying you look at the totality of circumstances to some extent?
Yes, and the reason why is over the years, including me as a forensic toxicologist, we've learned that blood drug levels don't necessarily correlate with some particular effect. We know they do with regards to alcohol, but with other drugs, we know that there's often not a predictable effect. So that's why you have to look contextually.
Okay. And fortunately or unfortunately, whatever way you look at this particular case, you could really, really look at this contextually because you have an actual video of everything that's occurring. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Right.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Just 2,
2? Okay.
2,
We'll count.
maybe 3. Doctor, how do you explain a person going from touchy-feeling to aggression?
Well, in this situation, a loved one was being threatened. So I think that was a common response to that confrontational environment. The gentleman was pointing at her. I couldn't hear anything, so I don't know exactly what the words were, but there was a confrontation. And the decedent went out to protect his loved one.
Okay. Were you here for any of the testimony in the case?
No.
All right. So you didn't hear that Mr.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yeah, I'll say it.
Thank you.
Well, Judge Heath?
Well, you asked the question and he answered it. So
And-
we're not going to get into all the testimony of the case,
I
okay?
understand, Judge. And you didn't know obviously, you don't know how Mr. McLaughlin was before, correct?
You mean before his death? No.
All right. And you don't know how the drug affected him that day because it could affect people differently.
Yes, but we do have a surveillance video of the incident.
Okay. All right. No further questions.
Okay.
All right, thank you, sir. You may step down. Is this witness released from a subpoena or is he on standby?
I believe he is going to remain. If it's
Okay,
okay with the court to remain in.
Okay, he'll remain in the building.
Remain in the courtroom as the defense
Okay.
expert has watched his testimony.
Right. All right, so you may step down. What says the state?
The people of the state of Florida, Your Honor, we rest.
Thank you. All right, members of the jury, we'll take a 10-minute break at this point, and then we'll let you know what's going on after that, okay? Thank you. Defense.
Yes, Your Honor. Can we